remember one time after the war, I was about 12. My father had a job in a factory across. And because he had lost his leg, he had a stump and an artificial leg. And in the summer, and there's nothing quite as ferocious as a New York August. We're on this assembly 8 hours a day, and I heard dark around 1 o'clock in the morning. And I knew that no matter what I ever did, that I had to honor the must honor. I think that's what the children of immigrants do. All of us. We know what up their countries. So they gave up their languages. They worked at the lousy, rottenest jobs in order to put food on our table. We have to honor that for the rest of our lives.
In early December 1883, a 34-year-old German Jewish poet named Emma Lazarus, appalled by the recent upsurge of anti-Semitic violence in Russia, submitted a 14-line poem to help the faltering fundraising campaign for the Pacific. The liberty her sonnet celebrated had nothing to do with the abstract political ideals the French had intended. A beacon of hope to oppressed people in the world. It was the future, reaching out to the present, to unchain humanity from the shackles of the past.
Promise of New York when it comes here is the promise of Emma Lazarus, the Statue of Liberty. And the reason that that poem, which structurally and in terms of the words used, could be thought to be very sentimental, certainly it is. And then it contains something. The test of that poem is that it is true. And these huddled masses yearning to be free did come here, and we did free. In fact, no matter who you are, at some point in your life, hearing those words or reading those words, just thinking of those words, your eyes will fill with tears. And what makes you tearful is that truth.
Give me your tired, your poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I'll never forget those words.
Emma Lazarus herself never saw the statue her poem so movingly commemorated, or the epic human tide it foretold. Traveling in Europe during the final months of the statue's construction, she was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. Passing through the harbor on her way home in the summer of 1887, she was too ill and weak even to come on deck. She died in her home in Manhattan 3 months later, at the age of 38. More than 15 years later, on May 6, 1903, a bronze plaque inscribed with her stirring words was finally affixed to the base of the statue. It would take decades more for Americans to realize the full meaning of the gift the French had given them.
Grandest supernova.
Not like the brazen giant of Greek
I'm
fame,
sorry, supernova. The supreme overlord,
conquering
grandest,
limbs
bro.
astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning.
Quentin and grandest to you, bro. You already know. Much love.
From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, You're poor. Your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my light beside the golden door. Emma Lazarus.
At 2 o'clock on the afternoon of May 11th, 1896, a photographer named William Hayes hoisted a strange-looking camera up onto a tripod at the southern end of Herald Square. Passers-by assumed he was about to expose a glass plate negative. But the cumbersome apparatus, the latest invention of Hayes's employer, Thomas Alva Edison, did not take still pictures. Instead, exposing one frame after another, each just an instant apart from the next, 16 times a second, it was capable of capturing for the first time the speed and vitality of urban life.
People were terrified. When they first saw these images, they had no idea what they were. They had just brief 15, 30-second shots of things, but they hand-tinted some of them to be colored. They did have this one film of a wall of water just rushing at you, and people got up in a panic and stormed out of the theater. I mean, just charged out of the theater because they thought that, the wall had broken down and there was some kind of tidal wave coming through the wall.
Mesmerized by the kinetic energy of New York, the first cameramen carried their equipment everywhere, shooting short films they called actualities. Real-life views of actual places and events. Most had no plots and no characters, and most lasted only a minute or two. But audiences everywhere flocked to see them, enthralled by the spectacle of the city itself, which by 1900 had become the greatest show on earth. What the cameras revealed was a city that now had the world's busiest harbor, the world's biggest ships and longest bridges, the worst slums and grandest mansions. It had a statue 15 stories tall and a park 840 acres in size. It had trains that ran 100 feet above the ground and leapt across rivers. Though the film sometimes captured grand civic ceremonies and great public events, the most effective were those of daily life. Entranced, as Walt Whitman had been, by the humblest and most ordinary of moments. A trolley moving down the street. A windy day. A woman's smile. The new motion pictures conveyed as nothing else
Grandest sis.
the mystery
Peace.
and beauty and democratic glory of the modern world.
Motion pictures come into play and they record the city, and they record it in such a way that make it even seem more exciting than it was. But certainly they capture the image of the city in motion as it had never been captured in the still photographs of an Underwood or Byron, who often had to photograph on a Sunday morning because the film moved so slow that if a cart moved by, you'd see it as a shadowy thing. Suddenly you catch that cart moving and see the New York traffic. And suddenly people become enthralled with what, in a certain way, they were rebelling against the 19th century. Traffic itself, density itself.
And yet, even as motion and change became a way of life in Manhattan, an even greater transformation was underway. Between 1898 and 1913, the human and physical and political landscape of the city would be transformed beyond recognition. During that time, the entire world would arrive on the city's doorstep, and most of those who came would be changed utterly by what they found there. But in the end, nothing would be more moving or prove to have more lasting consequences for the city and the nation than the changes the newcomers themselves would bring to the life of New York City. In little more than a decade, the 20th century itself would be born on the streets of New York, and nothing would ever be the same again.
Well, I think one of the great things about New York is it's not a static thing. It's not New York is. New York is always becoming. It's becoming physically as buildings are torn down and changed, much more so than any other American city. But it's also always becoming in terms of what it is in something we can't see, in the culture of the city. So the immigrants came to New York City, especially in these large numbers between the 1880s and 1920s, and made it their own, made it a kind of place that the world had never seen before, made it where there were more Italians in New York than there were in Naples. I mean, there were more Irish than in Dublin, more Greeks than in Athens. And it was an incredible experience because the city was so vast and so many of these immigrants were there that the city was open to these changes. So that even today, what is New York? It's more than a mosaic. It's a new kind of city.
If you were living in New York in those years at the turn of the century, you knew it was happening right there in front of you, in your village. And of course, it disturbed many people. Didn't like it. They thought it was going to ruin the country, and they were wrong.
It began in the 1880s, spurred on by poverty and persecution, by financial panic and political upheaval, by family strife and personal woe. They came not from Northern Europe this time, but from the East and from the South. Italians, Jews, Greeks, Poles, Russians, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Armenians, and Turks. Out of the remote and little-known reaches of Europe, one awestruck observer wrote, marches vast and endless.
There's a huge human tide, and coming on all the time, year after year, growing. In 1970, 1,200,000 people, 1,200,000 people came into the city of New York from Europe, primarily. There were 289,000 of them from Italy alone, 256,000 from Russia, just in 1 year. And in the long run, they gave us more than they got.
One way or the other, they had all heard the same thing. There was freedom and opportunity in America for anyone willing to work. And the place with the most jobs was the sprawling, unfathomably large seaport of New York. For most, it meant leaving everything familiar behind.
The day I left home, my mother came with me to the railroad station. When we said goodbye, she said it was like me going to my casket. I never saw her again.
Peace, Sony Blaze. Shout out to Sony Main Radio. Peace, brother.
There was a sense that the city, a message that the city whispered to its people and to people from all over the United States. You know, come here, everything is possible. Now, that's a seductive sound. It's a seductive whisper. And a lot of people failed at it, but at least the promise was there.
There's always been a fitting promise in New York. And the promise is there because it is the entrance city. It's the beginning. But I still think of it as a city to which, as James Joyce said about his characters, here comes everybody.
About 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, we all got up. The whole boat bent toward her because everybody went out. Everybody. She was beautiful, with the sunshine so bright and so big, and everybody was crying. The captain came and said, "Please, everybody, we should move a little bit to the center." But nobody would move.
thrill was unbelievable, but always the fear, because you have to go through Ellis Island. I heard all kinds of things that they would tell you on the boat. My God, I said, I hope they're not going to send me back. Joseph Delacey.
For decades, immigrants to New York had come through Castle Garden, a ramshackle state-run depot at the foot of Manhattan. But by 1890, the one-time concert hall had been completely overwhelmed by the tidal wave of new immigrants. And work had begun on a massive new federal installation, far out in the harbor, on an abandoned ammunition dump called Ellis Island. On December 17, 1900, the massive complex of brick, stone, and steel was finally complete. Built to accommodate 500,000 people a year, it was soon handling twice that number, sometimes as many as 12,000 a day. In 30 years, 12 million people would stream through the great echoing registry room, hoping to find sanctuary and a new beginning in America. More than 4 million of them would settle permanently in New York, tripling its population in less than a single lifetime.
Immigration made us huge. You could never have bred yourself into 8 million people in 50 years. Immigration did it. It also made for an industrial city. The people who were arriving were from the farms in the main, arriving here in curious reversals. It was when the wheat from Kansas began arriving in the Baltic that peasant population there became surplus. They turned around and arrived here.
On disembarking, the Pilgrim, vast, bewildering, impersonal machine, an assembly line for processing immigrants. With numbered tags pinned to their clothes, they were swiftly herded into long lines, then ushered inside the main building by harried immigration officials who barked orders at them in dozens of different tongues. Inspectors were required by law to turn back polygamists, paupers, criminals, and the mentally ill, or a physical disability, or a contagious disease. The inspections were brusque, irreversible, and carried out with astonishing speed. On the busiest days, the examiners had less than 6 seconds to detect any one of 60 conditions. The unlucky ones were swiftly removed from the line without explanation and sent to special examination rooms with chalk letters hastily scrawled on their coats. L for lameness, C for conjunctivitis, H for heart problems, X for suspected insanity. The examination for incurable disease of the eye was particularly traumatic. Anyone infected was sent back. 25-year-old Fiorello LaGuardia, working as an interpreter on Ellis Island to pay his way through law school, never forgot the harrowing scenes that ensued.
Sometimes, if it was a young child who suffered from trachoma, a rejected member of the family, when they learned their fate, they were stunned. They had never felt ill. They had never heard the word trachoma. They could see all right, and they had no homes to return to. Fiorello LaGuardia.
For the majority who passed the medical exam, the last hurdle was the registry room, where the final interrogation was held. The nearest earthly likeness, one man said, to the final day of judgment. In write his or her name, place of birth, destination, and occupation, how much money he or she had, whether he or she had ever been in jail or had ever been an anarchist. No immigrant's name was ever known to have been changed by the inspectors at Ellis Island, who merely confirmed information already before them in the ship's manifest. For 80% of the newcomers, the harrowing experience was over in 4 or 5 hours. And in the end, fewer than 1 in 50 were denied entrance to America. Without ceremony, the arrivals were curtly waved down a flight of stairs toward the exit, where, at a placing post, after separations that had sometimes lasted months or years, they were finally met by family and friends.
The Italian kisses his little children, but scarcely speaks to his wife. The Hungarian and Slavish people put their arms around one another and weep. The Jew of all countries kisses his wife and children as though he had all the kisses in the world and intended to use them all up quick.
Most of the immigrants quickly dispersed to town cities around the country. But for 1 in 4 new arrivals, the final destination was a 15-minute ferry ride away, on an island many of them would never leave again. On board the ferry, approaching the battery, they stood in wonder at the last and most extraordinary sight of all. An astonishing vision that seemed to corroborate everything they hoped the new world might be.
Everybody was looking at Manhattan, and I must admit, that sight I don't think I will ever forget.
I thought I was in heaven, city on earth, or a city in heaven.
The word skyscraper, which you associate with Manhattan, that's a sailor's term. It's the uppermost sail on a 3-mast rigged ship crossing over from Liverpool.
As were greeted by the 3 centuries before, New York City begun to soar straight up into the sky. It is as if some mighty force were astir beneath the ground, one man wrote, pushing up structures that a dozen years ago would have been inconceivable. Not since the advent of the great Gothic cathedrals 800 years before had there been such a revolution in the way men built.
What happened in the city of New York when the skyscraper was born is that buildings turned from crustaceans, which are supported by their walls, to vertebrates supported by their skeleton. But the skeleton had to be made out of steel. It's one of the great transforming moments in how we live on Earth as human beings. And suddenly, up out of this granite base of New York City, this island in the sea, and remember the East River is the sea, it's a tidal strait, it isn't really a river at all. Up out of that rises this new form, which is entirely American. And there it was for all the world to see when they came arriving at our doorstep.
Well, what we knew about it was 2 pieces of technology came together and made them technically possible. One was the electric elevator, and the other was steel. a masonry building, the walls, the thickness of the walls is a factor of how high you can build a building. And if it gets very high, the walls are so thick at the base, there's no room for using the building. I mean, it's like a pyramid, which, by the way, was the tallest building in the world up until the end of the 19th century.
The reason the great skyscrapers went up in Manhattan is that Manhattan is an island of very powerful rock, granite, and basically very high density rock that frankly digging foundations is unbelievably difficult. You have to blast to build in Manhattan. And the buildings went up in Manhattan because of the power of that bedrock. Once you dig that foundation, and when they dig, they really dig, they dig with dynamite. And once you dynamite out and you secure that foundation, that building isn't going anywhere.
With the advent of the elevator and steel frame construction, the low-slung four-story skyline of New York shot up with startling speed. Beginning with the 11-story tower building, called the Idiotic Building by skeptical New Yorkers, who on stormy days during its construction gathered at a safe distance and waited for it to collapse. It did not, and less than a year after it opened in 1888, it was surpassed by the World Building, which climbed to the unthinkable height of 18 stories. Stepping off on the top floor, one awestruck visitor called out loudly, "Is God in?" With each passing year, as the number and size of corporations headquartered in Lower Manhattan increased, the demand for space intensified. Limited as to the business seeks the air, the journalist Lincoln Steffens wrote. Confined on all sides, the only way out is up.
Once that process starts, moreover, there's a whole other set of meanings that get attributed to skyscrapers. Corporations love them because they are emblems. They are like registering their landmark in the sky over Manhattan. People use those buildings as corporate logos, as sources of identity in this new corporate marketplace.
Year after year, taller and taller buildings soared into the sky, the most tangible outward expression of the mighty economic engine, now drawing in people from every corner of the world. Americans have practically added a new dimension to space, one Scottish visitor wrote. When they find themselves a little crowded, they simply tilt a street on end and call it a skyscraper. In 1903, the 21-story Fuller Building went up at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 23rd Street, soon known as the Flatiron Building for its unusual shape. 5 years later, the Singer Building leapt up, twice as tall as the Flatiron. It was surpassed only 18 months later by the 50-story Metropolitan Life Building on Madison Square. By then, there were 550 structures over 10 stories tall in Lower Manhattan, whose soaring skyline had changed forever the meaning of the word city.
But there's something, last thing that's more intangible. What you've got is a civic culture which is enthralled with this development and incredibly supportive of it. Workers love these buildings. They wax rhapsodic about them. They develop new metaphors of these glorious mountains rising over the sky. There's a sense that New York is on the cutting edge of global civilization. All of the old wonders of the world were in Europe, the old-fashioned stuff, but now the new frontier of mankind is in the sky over Manhattan.
Remember that Lower Manhattan in particular, but even all of Manhattan, has this great advantage, even before airplanes, that you can get back from it and see it. You can take a picture of it. You can thrill people as they arrive from Europe, not only immigrants, they didn't care about them, but all those getting off all those liners. They look up and see Lower Manhattan. They say, what's that building? The Bankers Trust Company. What's that building? The Singer Sewing Machine Company. What a symbol. What an advertisement.
Gigantic, colossal, enormous, daring. There are no words. Words are inadequate to this apparition, this landscape. in which the vast river serves as frame for the display of still vaster human energy. Reaching such a pitch of collective effort, this energy has become a force of itself. It is the poetry of democracy, an immense concert. This is not the Parthenon, that little temple on a little hill. It is the obscure and tremendous poetry of the modern world, and it gives you a tragic shudder. There is in it so much of mad and willful humanity. Paul Bourget.
On a freezing cold day in early January 1904, with the temperature hovering at 15 below zero, 30-year-old Al Smith arrived in Albany to be sworn in for his first term in the New York State Legislature. The hard-working young man from the Lower East Side of New York was shocked by his reception in the Capitol, which was even more frigid than the weather. All through his first term, ignored by senior members and passed over again and again for committee assignments, he sat silently in the last row of the high-ceilinged chamber, bewildered by the intricacies of the legislative process and daunted by Albany's elaborate political rituals. During his entire first session in the Assembly, he did not make a single speech.
Not only was he not educated because he didn't have much schooling, but he didn't like to read. And he once said the only book he ever read all the way through in his life was The Life of John L. Sullivan. But he taught himself state government by simply reading every bill that he could read until the late hours of the night, night after night. People started to listen to him because somehow all these assemblymen realized, because he had been reading all these bills, and no matter what the subject was, this guy Smith knew about it. He had a grasp of state government that no one else had.
Slowly but surely, he began to make a name for himself. As his influence grew, and his confidence, he spoke more and more often from the floor of the Assembly, with the easy comic charm of a natural-born actor, on subjects he had mastered in stunning detail. In 1908, as his reputation grew, Silent Charlie Murphy, the boss of Tammany Hall, came up to get a better look at his rapidly rising young star.
Murphy's reaction to Smith is fascinating. He'd never had a conversation with him. And when he realized that Smith might be something very special, he called for a long talk, and he had a couple of his advisors there. And at the end of the talk, one of the advisors said to Silent Charlie, "You know, Al Smith never went to college." And Murphy looked at him and said, "If he went to college, he wouldn't be out."
He was himself open. More and more often now, he threw dinner parties for his colleagues at Keeler's restaurant on State Street, regaling them with tales from his childhood on the Lower East Side. By then, the old neighborhood in the Fourth Ward, in the shadow of the bridge, had been changed beyond recognition by the tremendous influx of newcomers.
Every 4 years, New York adds to itself a city the size of Boston or St. Louis. It is the largest Jewish in the world, the largest Irish city, one of the largest German cities. More than 700,000 Russians come from Rome. New York is the great whirlpool of the races. Edwin Hill.
No city was more appropriate to become the immigrant metropolis than New York. From the time of initial Dutch settlement in the 1620s, all through the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. By any comparison in the world, New York was a multicultural, multi-ethnic. heterogeneous metropolis. It had established a kind of a tradition of openness to newcomers, of never having a single dominant culture. But still, when you think about the incredible migration between, let's say, roughly 1880 and 1925, when millions, not just come to the United States, come through New York City every year, they transform the city.
Even by the standards the city itself had set, the mammoth influx of peoples was without precedent in world history. By 1905, 4 out of 5 New Yorkers were now either the children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. No fewer than 70% of the city's public school children had been born outside the country. Forever after, Americans would view New York as a kind of foreign country.
By 1900, the Lower East Side was, at least to an American, was not an American place, because it was strange babble of tongues of Eastern European Jews, or little Italy's had sprung up. Completely ethnic neighborhoods, not separate unto themselves. But if you'd been walking on the streets, it would have been hard to tell where we were in at the time.
Most of Elizabeth Street was Sicilian, came from Sicily. And what that is that a couple of the immigrants came over on a boat, 1901, 1902, 1910, and they were lucky enough to get a job, and luckier to get 2 rooms. They used to call them rooms, not apartments, in the tenements. What was happening in 230 was that people from one town staying in that one building. So that 232 became Chimina, which is a beautiful town outside of Palermo, that is where it comes from. Now, 241 across the street, the same thing was happening, but mainly from people from Polizzi Generosa, which is also outside of Palermo, but higher in the mountains. That's my father's father comes from. So they were across the street, and when my mother said that she met my father, there was a problem because there were different nationalities. She used the phrase different nationalities, and the reality is just from different villages.
In coming to New York, the immigrants had not only lost an ocean, they had, in most cases, exchanged an ancient way of life for the most modern and frenetic environment on Earth. The old had been wretched, the writer Irving Howe later said, but it was a thoroughly known place where one's ancestors lay buried. It did not loom up to terrifying heights. It required no special knowledge of machines in shops or on trolleys, and it seldom had much to do with the rigors of the clock.
I think that there is a tremendous sense as well of people making a leap from, in many cases, life that was like the Middle Ages into the most modern cosmopolis in the world. I mean, think about these people coming from places like Russia or Poland, in which life was really not a lot different than it had been a couple of hundred years ago. Then you're coming to New York, where you're in the most modern city of the world. You're making an enormous leap into modernity.
The Jews who come at the time come from a million different places, though mostly from Eastern Europe. And you have people from every class in society coming. You have people who were rich in the old country and who lost it all. And then you have people who are in the middle and who come with a little bit of property, and then the most people come with nothing. All they come with is their capacity for labor power and the ideas in their heads and their capacity to think. And Hegel says that's the most important kind of capital for modern man, the capacity to think. And if you've got that, you can make up for everything else that you don't have.
The question is, how did it come that New York attracted all of this energy, was able to channel all this energy? And one is the geography thing. 2 is the energy of the people who were here, who brought with them generations of pent-up unfulfillment from where they came from. The Irish had been put down in Ireland for a long time, so they came here and they, by God, they were going to make it in America, and they were going to show what the Irish really could do. And then the Germans who came were not the Germans who were happy at home. They were the Germans who were ticked off at home. But if you put all the Chinese or all the Eastern European Jews or all the Irish in the city, and they are in concentrated areas, and they're 5-7 stories high and miserable housing, They have to be out on the streets and they have to be struggling to do something better so they can get out of that awful housing. Well, that's your engine.
Often when they came, they were shocked to discover that this wasn't what they thought it would be. And there are plenty of accounts of immigrants talking about life on the Lower East Side as being so far away from what they imagined the land of dollars to be, or the streets paved with gold. There's a great deal of sorrow and sense of loss for many immigrants.
By 1900, the most crowded neighborhoods in the world were in New York City, especially on the Lower East Side, but also in East Harlem. Conditions were abysmal. We don't need to exaggerate when we say that it's possible that housing conditions in New York City, certainly crowded, exceeded anything that the world has ever known before or since.
Crowded into stifling, often lightless tenements, immigrants escaped whenever they could to the street. Block to block, from long dawn until long after dark, the streets were one vast, raucous, open-air bazaar, teeming with peddlers and vendors of every kind, hawking their wares from the sidewalks or from pushcarts, rented for 10 cents a day. By now, the streets of the Lower East Side were jammed with more than 25,000 pushcarts, which sold everything from vegetables, hands, tools, and in the poorest wards, peddlers sold goods in minute quantities: a single candle, the wing of a chicken, one egg, or just the yolk of one egg.
Forget your past, your customs, your ideals. Select a goal and pursue it with all your might. You will experience a bad time, but sooner or later, you will achieve your goal. A bit of advice for you. Do not take a moment's rest. Run, do, work, and keep your own good in mind. A final virtue needed in America: cheek. Do not say, I cannot, I do not know. G.M. Price.
You take whatever is available to survive. People can get sanctimonious about immigrant groups and what they do, but they do what they have to do to survive. That's also a law of the city. It is a law from the beginning, and it will be at the end. And that's not always going to work on Wall Street, because that's not accessible to people. Cities are also about people coming from one environment and really making a tremendous adjustment into another and doing what they have to do to survive. That is not often a pretty picture in cities, or not always a pretty picture.
Nobody dragged them here. Nobody brought them here in chains. They came exhilarated by what was here, by the possibility of it. In my case, my parents are both Catholic at best. So the sense that their children and they themselves could function in a place where nobody's going to ask their religion, amazing. The case of the Jews is, of course, the great example. You know, to go in one generation from the shtetl to have your kids graduate from universities in one generation, amazing. And that energy, that challenge, the questioning that goes on with someone who's new, saying, why is that here? Why does it work that way? Why do you do it that way? What if we do it this way? That kind of energy, I think, was the essence of it.
For most, process of assimilation played marked speed. In less than a single generation, in just 10 years on average, most families on the Lower East Side had moved up or on.
The Jews start a little bit higher in the sense that they come with skills, needle trades often, and a little bit more money in their pocket, and rise higher. But the Italians also rise rapidly. So that what you have in this cauldron down in Lower Manhattan, you have these groups making an astonishing change in the space of a single generation or two, so that New York is what it was advertised. It was a city of opportunity, and the nation was rags to riches, no. But to get a solid job, to get a foothold in the land, to change from that peasant status that you've known, New York turns out to be the best place in the United States to do that between about 1880 and certainly 1925.
The absolute demand of the city that you get to know each other, because you had to. You couldn't really stay in a ghetto and function. You had to leave the ghetto to go to work. You had to go to Manhattan. You had to go to Midtown. You had to go uptown. You had to go down, wherever it was. People moved, and the subway then became one of these great binding elements in the city that moved people around and put them up against each other. And sometimes they came up against each other in conflict, but the conflict didn't ever last very long. The Irish fought the Italians until they started marrying them. And then they both fought the Jews until they started marrying them.
It's a constant negotiation. How much will I let go of who I have been, and how much will I take on of a new persona? And that is true within a family, and is true for an individual. Parents wanting the children to maintain traditions that have helped define their own lives from their own culture, their own religious group, their own racial group, their own language group. And the children wanting to be American. And that often to the children means sloughing off these other, what they would consider vestiges of the old ways. For the parents, this is who we are. This conflict is set up.
We have to be Americans. We shall be. We shall learn English. We shall love America and help to build America. We shall accomplish in the new world 100 times more than we could in the old. But you'll not be able to erase the old home from your heart. The heart will be drawn elsewhere. And in your solitude, images will rise up and stare in your faces with eternal sorrow. Abraham Cahan.
What is a New Yorker? Is he Jew or Irish? Is he English or German? Is he Russian or Polish? He may be something of all these, and yet he is wholly none of them. Something has been added, which he had not before. He is quicker in his movement, less trammeled in his judgment. Though he may lose wisdom in sharpening his wit, the change is unmistakable. New York, indeed, resembles a magic cauldron. Those cast into it are born again. Charles Whibble.
The astonishing phenomena is that these people are attracted because there are job possibilities here, and to an amazing extent, the job possibilities are involved in providing the goods and services for the newcomers who are arriving. What you set up is this astonishing self-fulfilling, feeding on itself a state of affairs. But there's also the fundamental fact of what's making the economy go. The port is exploding. And as the port explodes, partly because all those immigrants are coming in, those immigrants are the ones who are working on loading the goods and services.
By 1900, the millions of newcomers pouring into New York were propelling an era of expansion and physical growth without precedent in the city's history. In the years to come, in little more than a decade, they would fill out and then draw together the 5 separate boroughs of the metropolis, transforming New York along the way into the most modern city on earth.
One of the things that drove people crazy was that you've now got this huge greater New York, 370 odd square miles, and the vast majority of the population is huddled in Manhattan and down in the Lower East Side. The Bronx, at the time of consolidation, was still a rural backwater. The question is,
All right, guys, I'm gonna show you guys another video that's like crazy. It's the same timeline and just the behind the scenes of other things going on. You're gonna see what they did to the indigenous. They didn't mention it in there, as you said earlier. They did show one flash. It was a picture. One picture they showed. It was 3 indigenous people standing there, well dressed, looking fly. I know y'all saw it. It flashed. They didn't mention it. They didn't say anything about it. They just threw it in there like, y'all see this, and that was it. That was crazy. I should have stopped in and said something about it, but I'm sure you guys saw it. If you didn't, actually, let me see if I can go back to that part real quick. If I can find where it was. Hold on, because just in case you guys didn't see it, I'm going to see. I want you to see that they literally flashed through it like 2 seconds of, oh, look at these beautiful black people. And then it's like, they're gone. Not a mention of who they were, not anything. Hold on a second. I'm going to hop right back to work. Let's see. Okay, let me go up. Hold on. I just want to see if I can find it, just in case of you guys that did not see that picture real quick. I'm going to see. Let me do that. Okay, let me see. I want you guys to see that how they flash through, and everybody else looking, just all any kind of way. You could tell these people had money. Just let's see. I want you guys to see that. Yeah, this internet trying to play with me. Hold on, let me see. I'm gonna try to see if I can pull up on it. Where was it? It was showing all the different people. Maybe there they go. I knew I was gonna find it. There they go. Look at that. Look at that. Let's play that part. Look how they flash through that picture. I'm gonna show y'all real quick. Not a mention. They talked about every immigrant, everything. Not a mention. Watch
Put
this.
their arms around one another and weep. The Jew of all countries kisses his wife and children as though he had all the kisses in the world and intended to use them all up quick.
So you guys see that, right? So they talked about every person. They said how the Jew greeted, how the Polish greeted. They talked about every person about which ones greeted who, right? But it never mentioned what these 3 women were doing. It never mentioned anything about them. Why? Because these were the people looking like, what the hell going on with all these damn people? You guys remember we read in the book last week, and it was talking about how the people came and flooded the land. And when they came and flooded the land, they just came and took it over. So now watch, listen again. Watch, they're gonna flash. They showing the picture, right? They're gonna flash through it. Watch this. Yeah, wasn't that crazy, bro? You seen that, right? Nothing. They said something about every one of them. What did y'all have to say about the indigenous? Nothing. Check this out. Wait, I gotta stop this. This is almost a 2-hour video, y'all. I'm gonna drop it in the
Most of the
chat
immigrants quickly dispersed.
in case you guys want to see it.
Towns and cities
Hold on.
around the country.
Let me grab it real quick. Okay. All right. I'm gonna drop this in the chat. Right. This is the first video. And then what we're going to do, I'm going to pull up this next one that y'all got to see. It's 2 hours long, too, so we ain't going to watch it either. But I'm definitely going to show you guys some very important parts in it. That's like crazy. So hold on a second. Let me get that pulled up, and I'll be right with you guys.
Or scarred and depleted by the famine, Irish were America's first refugee population. Its first huddled masses. They washed into East to Florida. By sheer numbers, people would previous waves of immigration. The famine Irish, and fairly communal, would come to define Irishness in America. But they would have no Plymouth Rock, no Ellis Island, no. In life and in death, they were for the most anonymous. And for most, arrival in America meant little more than the possibility of survival. On the levee of New Orleans, their only hope for the future was that they would not starve.
All of the sick were laid out on pallets, one beside the other, just skin and bones. Too ill and too weak, really even better.
Now, grubbing fruit, grubbing meat, scratching in the earth, maybe the most miserable ones picking at straw from the street. And the group that contemporary observers as the saddest group were the lost children.
Parents often fled Ireland without their children, and only later secured enough money to send for them. But no parent could prove what children had boarded, and even if they knew, ship's arrival didn't.
They would actually advertise for lost children or a lost child. Mary O'Connell, sent to New Orleans between such and such dates, aboard the steamer Atlantic, lost in the city.
Some are rather heartrending, trying to describe a child named Mary, her own last name, and the parents desperately trying to find him. Not with much success, I suspect.
For the newly arriving Irish, New Orleans was a purgatory, a netherworld between the watery crossing and the solid ground of America. Most of the city sat at the bottom of a bowl-shaped depression, surrounded by the Mississippi River, Lake Pontchartrain, and hundreds of thousands of acres of marshland. The high ground was long since settled, so the Irish were bottom of the bowl, where they watched the waterways drain back at them, flood and fill their homes with water. Neighborhoods were a bilious soup, thick and festering. Typhus and consumption seeped into the ocean. In sweltering summer months, mosquitoes bred in the cisterns and the swamps, carried malaria, hemorrhagic malaria, and the most feared yellow fever. The Irish were especially susceptible to these diseases because once they were strong enough to go to work, the jobs they could find in the swamps.
Very few of them had skills except for scratching a living in a potato patch. So they're going to take whatever job is available, what anybody will pay them to do. And one job that's available for an immigrant who's willing to risk his life is ditching. That the area like like New Orleans, you have to have ditches to drain.
Slave owners, for example, respected black laborers much more than they did Irish laborers. The Irish in places where they could get more, you put them in the kind of situation, wouldn't want to risk black slaves.
Slaves were an investment by the slave owner, where you would only have to pay Irishmen wages. If a slave was killed in a dangerous job, the entire investment was lost. If the Irishman was killed, he just got another one. There was no downside to using Irishmen. Chew them up, spit them out, get another one. And there were plenty of friendships.
The Irish have a sense coming into all the differences of this they run a very good chance of occupying the bottom place in American society. And that's one of the causes of the tensions that will exist between Irish and African Americans, this kind of people at the bottom, a kind of classic American confrontation of who's going to get up, that there's not room for both of us.
Free people of color were already moving up that ladder, working in skilled trades like masonry and tailoring. For the unskilled and the slaves, what little hope they had came from hard labor.
When the Irish came, the jobs were held by the black people of the city, free and some slave. Even the slaves were allowed to work from time to time for pay. Some of the masters split the pay with the slaves. Others let the slaves have the pay and save it toward buying their own freedom.
The one skill the famine Irish knew was survival. Wage-paying jobs promised survival, and the Irish meant to do whatever it took to get them. This was the beginning of one of the longest-running racial grudge wars in the country. And by 1850, they were being played out in the port of Charleston and Savannah, upriver in St. Louis, and in the big cities of New York and Philadelphia. In New Orleans, the Irish fought their way out of the swamp.
The most readily available jobs were on the dock. The Irish had to have those jobs. There was no other way for them to survive. So they fought a very desperate fight. If they gave up, where did they go? There was nowhere to go. If they didn't get the job, they would starve and starve. So the Irish would come up against the blacks, form gangs, and just attack them.
Irish gangs would stone black or beat them up. But when the blacks fought back, nobody else stood with them. The Irish were white men, after all, and free to do what they had to. By 1853, the Irish in New Orleans had taken over the jobs on the docks as stevedores, riverboat crew, bailmen, and on the land as draymen and hacks. And there was a sense that New Orleans was a place the famine Irish could make it. That New Orleans, after all, might just be a little town.
In 1803, there was a sense of optimism in New Orleans. The newspapers even were saying that yellow fever was a thing of the past. That New Orleans had gone through 4 or 5 years without any real epidemics. On the 27th of May, I believe it was, the first case of yellow fever was reported in the city. It was reported at Charity Hospital, and the newspapers failed to pick it up. The newspapers actually downplayed the presence of yellow fever in the city of New Orleans during the entire month of June.
City officials refused to establish a board of health for fear it would scare trade away from its bustling docks. The immigrant ships, unwarned, continued to carry their payload to port.
There was a term used at the time, always in the newspapers and the reports, called unacclimated, which meant newcomers. Because yellow fever, of course, once you've lived through it the first time, you develop a certain immunity to it. Well, they are all unacclimated. All the famine Irish had come over after the last epidemic.
So many newly arrived Irish and German immigrants contracted yellow fever that it was commonly called the stranger's disease.
As it got into the summer months, the incidence of yellow fever picked up. We were going from 9 a day, I think the first week of July, and then it was 15 to 20 a day the next week, and went up exponentially from that point. By the middle of August, there were 220 some dying a day.
By then, anybody who could afford to had left New Orleans, fair towns of Biloxi and Ocean Springs, or the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. People of means resumed life in their summer homes, while the less well-off hired rooms to wait out the epidemic. The poor remained in New Orleans.
For the people really who were ill, or those who were serving the ill, according to the newspapers anyway. And in fact, it got so bad that one of the newspapers, instead of reporting news one day, said, yesterday was dull. There was nothing happening in the city, except people dying.
The Catholic priest who had the responsibility of last rites and burying the dead and having some service, they never stopped. The funerals were constant, so that the business was burying the dead.
During the months July and August of 1853, almost 1 Irishman in 5 died in New Orleans. In Ireland, during the years of the famine, the 4 or 5 years, 1 out of 7 died.
October, the weather broke and the epidemic subsided. By then, 10,000 people were dead in a city of little more than 100,000. Native New Orleanians were horrified, sure that it was the immigrant and not the disease that had turned their city into a necropolis. The Irish should stop coming to the tropical climate of New Orleans, critics advised, and go to Boston to a climate more like New Orleans.
My great-great-grandmother came in December of 1851. And if anybody knows Boston winters, it was very cold. And these passengers were noted to be half naked, you know, that they had very little clothing to begin with, and it certainly wasn't heavy winter clothing.
The Irish peasants from the very beginning looked physically ridiculous. You had men in hats done in 30 years in innumerable areas and long tail coats and leggings. People aren't dressed like this anymore. They're comical. They don't know they're comical till they get off the boats and people are laughing at them.
What New Englanders saw was a group of people who would have to learn what it was to be an American, which was, by their reckoning, a loyal, productive, and independent thinking citizen. But little in the famine immigrants' past had prepared them for being citizens of a nation. Most had left the old world without an idea, even, of what it meant to be Irish. Before leaving for America, few had been more than 15 miles from home. They identified themselves by the landscapes they knew, their county, their townsland, their parish. And they entered Boston mistrustful, insular, not a little bit frightened, grasping for safety in the familiar and faceless enclaves growing within the city.
They went to where their friends and families were. And in Boston, the North End was one of the premier Irish neighborhoods. But even within the North End, the Cork people went to the area around North Square, whereas the Donegal people would go over around Endicott Street, another part of the North End.
My grandmother used to talk about Cork Hill. That's where all the Corkonians stayed. Then there'd be Galway City. They wanted to be with their own kind, so they considered Galway here and Cork here. It was a distinct entity.
Native Bostonians watched this clannish new immigrant population and grew increasingly uneasy. Boston's Protestants took seriously their inheritance and their mission on God's earth. To the degree that these descendants of the Puritans had followed the Creator's light, they had prospered. World trade had made great fortunes for the elect, and they had built the city foreordained by John Winthrop in his sermon on the Arabella 2 centuries before. We shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people upon us. This merchant ruling class was virtuous, forthright, abstemious, and in God's name, charitable. They had been among the earliest and most generous givers to the cause of Irish famine relief. They had ruled Boston, Massachusetts, and New England for generations. They held its high political offices, ordered its social life, and acted as its cultural benefactors. But by the middle of the 19th century, it was clear to them the Boston they had created and tended so diligently was under siege. In 1 year alone, 30,000 Irish Catholic immigrants entered the city of little more than 100,000.
The Irish lived in shanties. They lived in buildings that had been inhabited by the residents that were here before they got here. In the homes that already existed, people would have to vacate because they certainly didn't want to live with all these Irish. So when they came in, they would house maybe 6 people, would now house 36 people.
Reports circulated of destitute immigrants living in dank basements and lightless garrets. Epidemics swept through Irish neighborhoods and threatened adjacent ones. The can-do Bostonians took up a study of the problem of poverty. They thought they'd fix it, but the Irish just kept coming.
If you think of what the Irish were doing at the time, it meant that poor people not only were poor when they got here, they were voluntarily staying poor in order to get the next batch over. So that Americans who may have been sympathetic to their poverty start to really begin to blame the Irish as being a very stubborn people that is never going to wholly embrace American values.
They're filling the jails, they're filling the orphanages, they're filling hospitals. Anglo-Protestants are saying these people are ruining our city. They're destroying this beautiful city on the hill.
The governor of Massachusetts made a calculation reminiscent of an Irish landlord. It would be cheaper to send the destitute back to Ireland than to support them in America. The most shrill condemnations, however, issued from the Yankee working class, a class of people frightened by changing times. Displaced farm workers were being forced into low-paying jobs in the factories of South Boston and outlying towns. Skilled craftsmen were being shoved aside by machines. Competition from Irish laborers only stirred the pot.
The average pay of an Irishman per day in Ireland was 8 cents. So can you imagine? Over here, an average workman was paid $1.25 a day. And here's a guy who's willing to work for somewhere between 8 cents and $1.25. I mean, you obviously didn't like him instantly the minute you heard about him.
Popular depictions of the Irish, the wild Irish as they were called, would grow more and more cruel.
Right, bro.
In the press, they were portrayed as drunken, dim-witted, addicted to simians.
I hate to pause it because I don't want to issue, but I gotta pause it. That part right there, that just clarification. When they tell on themselves, y'all know they always have to tell on themselves. Just like they keep flashing the pictures of the Indians. Look, they was here, these was here, they were here. In the other picture, they showed that one flash of the Indians there. Just now, they just showed one flash of it. They didn't mention it. They ain't say nothing about it now, but it's like, see, we put it in there. We showed you guys, right? Bull. So as it's showing, it said the people that were, it said taking over the lands of the inhabitants that were there in their homes, taking over the homes, sleeping in their beds, wearing their clothes, laying in their sheets, wearing their shoes, walking in everything that they had, eating their food that was left behind. Yeah, all that. Because remember, they was eating rotten food. They ate rotted food. So anything, even if it was something that they left way before they invaded a particular neighborhood, they would eat that food because it was sitting there waiting on them. Anything, everything that we had, they just walked right into it and took it over, assumed the land, assumed the property, made these BLM offices, created land titles to let them assume the lands of different areas, so on and so forth. Come on, man.
And as Catholics, a threat to democracy itself. And the numbers were alarming. While Protestantism was splintering into new evangelical sects, Catholics were on their way to becoming the largest denomination in America. In the 1850s, the number of naturalized citizens in Massachusetts, most of them from Ireland, tripled.
Catholics, suddenly they're becoming not so much of a minority. In some cities, they're becoming close to a majority. And for the first time in American history, you have the idea of political power is going to pass to another religious group.
To Protestants who had been raised on a tradition that Pope were a threat to American freedom, that their ancestors had spent the War of the Revolution fighting against the Popish French and the Spanish. This was, here they were on their doorstep, these Popish Irish.
Driven by a new political movement emerged, a movement made of born Protestants who were trying desperately to hold on to an America that was already gone, an America that belonged to them alone. Their agenda was clear and simple. They meant to choke off the foreign vote. They would limit immigration and naturalization and deny political office to those not born in America. Membership in the party was exclusive to native-born Protestants, born of Protestant parents, united in marriage.
They had many elements of the Ku Klux Klan. There was some guy from Baltimore, I think he was called the Grand Triumvirate Illustrator. I can't remember the names that they had. And they had secret handshakes and eye signals, and God knows every time they twitched, I guess they communicated. And when you asked them anything about their organization, they were taught to say, "I know nothing."
The Know Nothing movement practiced its politics in the streets, was a means of escorting voters to polls, keeping a vote on the ballot boxes. Out of this political street brawl, the Know Nothings created one of the most successful third-party movements in American history. In 1855, they won governorships in Kentucky, California, and Rhode Island, and took over the state legislature in Massachusetts.
They had a former president, Millard Fillmore, as their chief spokesman. So they had a lot of people with some prestige front of them because they could be built up into a national movement. And they had a formidable group in the House of Representatives, 40 or 50 people, and a number of senators. So they definitely were a considerable worry.
The nativists were passionate, they were bold, and they were principled after a fashion, but they couldn't count. The Irish, who had streamed into America, already had the vote. And they were determined to make this point. It was their country too. As the more pressing issue of slavery overtook the nation, Fillmore ran a distant third for president, and the nativist movement was all but dead as a political party. But in the few years the Know Nothings held sway, they made a lasting, if ironic, contribution. They helped to create the story of Irish America, the story that provided these immigrants a new identity for a new world. To be Irish, as the Croconians and the Carrymen and the Fardowns like to tell the tale, was to be up against it, exiled from their homeland, persecuted. To be Irish, to be just wild enough to stand up and fight for what was yours. To be Irish was to be thick-skinned and survivor tough, and to know the value of sticking together.
I think for many of them, the first sense they had being Irish was when they got to the United States, because people didn't care what parish they were from or what county. What mattered, Irish. And in a sense, I think some of them woke up to the Irish identity for the first time when they got to the United States, that they weren't Croconians or members of a certain parish. They were Irish.
Well, it's by the hush me boys, and sure that Paddy, you must go and fight for Lincoln.
Congress volunteers signed on to fight under the colors of Irish brigades or regular army. They fought with Lindbergh, where they killed one another by the scores of thousands.
General Marr to us he said, you get a new leg. Every mother's son use get a pension. Well, myself, I lost me leg. They gave me leg. And God, this is truth to you I mention.
The full Irish war record was a complicated one. Incensed by laws that permitted the rich to buy their way out of the fight, Irishmen staged the bloodiest riots in the country. And on the field of battle, just as high a percentage of native-born Americans and German immigrants fought and died. But it was the Irish who came out of the war with a reputation for bravery and a willingness to spill their blood for the country. The Germans wrote dark operas. The Irish knew how to write a lament people could carry in their heads.
Here's you, boys, now take my advice. To America I'll have yous not become. There is nothing here but war, where the margarine cannons roar. It was at home in dear old Dublin.
War had created an industrial boom in the North, new ways to raise fast cash for building projects. Americans were spreading out across the plains and toward the Pacific. The canal had helped to build in the 1820s and 30s couldn't move far enough fast enough. Roads were needed, new rails. America's appetite for labor was insatiable. A big city broadsheet might carry ads for 3,000 laborers each day. The ads promised good wages and steady work for any man willing to pick up and leave the city. And Irishmen fanned out into the vastness of the continent.
They knew that as long as they were willing to do the hard and often dangerous work of a building and industrializing nation, that they would never be out of work. This was a nation in the process of being built, and they would be its builders.
As they pushed the railroad west, Irish workmen were killed by falling beams and exploding steam engines, and left behind in unmarked graves. Like the canal workers before them, these men lived a reckless, hard-fisted life, bedding down in shacks that would collapse a week after the men moved on, or in bars that followed on the rails. Saloons moved with them.
All right, we finna get to a better part, guys. Here we go. This is the last video I'm gonna show. This one actually was, this is another one that was that's about 2 hours long. And I'm gonna drop it in the chat for you guys if you wanna look at it so you can have it for proof. This will show, you know, some of those shenanigans. Give me 1 second. Let me get this next video pulled up, and we'll be out here after this. Just one moment.
New York City's Great White Way, Broadway. 1920s, the nightlife here glittered. Bands played, liquor flowed, and everyone who was drinking it was. In the first month of the new decade, the 18th Amendment became the law. The sale and consumption of alcohol illegal.
Was prohibition, but oddly enough, nobody paid any attention to it.
We went to people's homes. They served dreadful things called orange blossoms, which was gin and orange juice. Revolt. Bad gin at that.
Liquor was now sold behind closed doors in what is called speakeasies. Proprietors took the risks and reaped the profits.
It was good money in those days. I was 15 years old. I was riding around with a Nash convertible. We had 4 speakeasies. One by the Daily News, one by the Daily Mirror. You had a peephole, you let him in. Okay. A guy had to explain who he was, and he'd show you an ID or something, and you let him in. You get to know his family after a while.
Every corner. Now, the saloon, of course, they were never raided by. The cops were a big part of that business. People wanted. It was a big game.
It became a danger game for the high-stakes players. Battles between rival gangs for control of illegal liquor territories riddled American cities with mushroom. Was to sweep liquor on the streets. Now they were flooded with handguns.
You had to have them, or else.
Prohibition and the general disregard which followed it was the perfect symbol for the 20s, a decade which was about crossing the line, smashing tradition, breaking boundaries. As modern America came of age in the 1920s, boundaries of all sorts, technological, geographical, and social, were shattered. The roar in the Roaring '20s was the birth scream of the modern. America was now about to leave behind the formative experience of its rural past and embrace the promise of an urban future. But progress would have its price. A sudden, wrenching departure from the certainties of the traditional and the familiar, spread by an emerging mass media, movies, and the radio. Things that seem old and familiar now were just beginning to take shape in the 1920s. At the dawn of the 1920s, America was clearly entering a new era, an era defined by a vast and complicated urban that would dominate the rest of the 20th century. After war was an eagerness to embrace the new, and it was in America's cities, most dramatically in its biggest, New York, where the modern age was born. The very architecture of the city spoke of America's new ascendancy and her aspirations.
The skyscraper was an example of the new form achieving a kind of thrilling scale and nobility. More people worked there than lived in the average small town in America.
A movement to the cities that had started during World War I accelerated. In 1920, for the first time, more Americans lived in urban centers than in country towns and villages.
The pace has been set in the cities. The city is irresistibly attractive, is really at a kind of high tide in this decade. It's a force, a magnet
The very streets would be synonymous with innovation. The latest in American entertainment has come to stand bustling new business advertising, which was uniting the nation in a set of shared fantasies and desires. And Wall Street came to represent the decade's expanding economic opportunities. Wall Street was where the action was. People came from everywhere to get in on it.
The reason I come to New York was there was nobody there after they closed the mines in 1926 in Pennsylvania. There was no money coming there. This fella Jerry got me the first job. And he said, "Come on down to Wall Street. The streets are paved with gold."
It seemed that way, too, on Park and Fifth Avenues, where the tycoons lived. The number of millionaires in the 1920s jumped 400% over the previous decade. The 20s' feeling of limitless horizons was fueled by their lavish lifestyle.
Our family had a house at 934 Fifth Avenue when I was growing up. We had a place in Tuxedo Park and a house in New York, and then we used to come to Southampton in the summer. Everybody seemed to be having a good time.
In those days, you had lots of help. You had a cook, you had a kitchen maid, and you had a laundress. And then you had a parlor maid, a chambermaid, and mother's maid. How many does that make? 6, but I think there were 8 actually. Terribly nice people.
Almost everybody had a boat. I recall in the 20s, you would see a harbor filled with yachts. I mean, really filled, almost gunnel to gunnel. And we didn't refer to yachts as such unless they were 100 feet or over. There was a great deal of entertainment, all done in pieces, seated dinner parties of 50, 60. Always after dinner, there would be entertainment by guests. George Gershwin was there with his orchestrator, Bill Daly. They got up and played on 2 pianos. Mother always had 2 grand pianos in the big room downstairs.
A house or a laptop? Which one do you think is worth more? Well, definitely not the house, because it not only costs, but you also have to pay to maintain it every month. What if I told you that I've made over $80 million all from something called digital estate on my laptop? Digital real estate costs nearly nothing to start, and it creates real online assets that have the potential to generate income. And I'm surprised, frankly, that nobody else is talking about this right now. But if you don't want to hear more about it, just video. So my name is Jeff Lerner, and I did not become a multimillionaire the traditional way. I didn't work 40 years for the man. I didn't invent anything. Definitely didn't inherit a trust fund or win the lottery. But I did take advantage of digital real estate. And since then, I've generated over $80 million. I've been on the Inc. 5000 list twice, won a bunch of other awards. And most importantly, I've helped tens of thousands of other people with what I've learned. Now for the also unlock the secret of digital real estate and create your own incredible life, all in a simple book called The Millionaire Shortcut. Now, I'm not going to do this forever, but for right now, The Millionaire Shortcut is 100% free. No catch, no shipping costs, and no credit card. And I'll send this right to your email, and you can download it instantly. So click the link on your screen right now, go to my website, and enter your email to download your free copy. And this book is less than 20 pages. You could be reading it in the next 5 minutes, and you'll be done in the next hour. And I promise it's going to be the most powerful book
Gershwin, who wrote Rhapsody in Blue and other anthems of the decades, was profoundly in music he had heard and loved called jazz. The cap jazz in the 1920s was just a subway ride uptown in Harlem. It was in Harlem clubs that one could see the artists at the forefront of this fresh and unique American music. Performers such as Armstrong.
I know, bro. I know.
Bessie Smith.
Shit be sick.
And a dapper young man named Edward Kennedy Ellington. His friends simply called him Duke.
Duke was the essence of what black music was all about. Everybody else was heading in that direction, but Duke was there.
The first time that I was seized by the music was the first time I heard Duke Ellington broadcast from the Cut Club, where Broadway, Hollywood, Paris, rub elbows. People came from all over to experience what was going on in Harlem in the 20s.
I was young then, and often we went up to Harlem at night to dance and everything. We all saved up for months to get the money to go out to a nightclub. Of course, the music was wonderful.
Harlem was contributing more than music to America's new urban culture. The world above New York's 125th Street was, in the 1920s, a hotbed of political, social, and cultural activity. It was later called Harlem Renaissance.
The Harlem Renaissance is one of those terms that white folks invent when they want to take a particular look at some aspect of black folks. I don't black folks run around saying that we're going to have us a renaissance or something like that, but it was a holiday of the spirit.
In Harlem was born this idea of the new Negro, someone who stood up for the Negro, who advertised his and her contributions to American culture, who was proud to be Black.
Harlem was the end of the line, the promised land, the place where all our fantasies came true. If I had to choose between heaven and Harlem, Harlem, of course, would win every time.
While Harlem seemed a promised land for Black Americans, New York's Lower East Side was for European immigrants their gateway to the American dream.
We were blessed because we were in America. My father came from the Ukraine. He went to work in New York City and worked in a factory where they blocked hats, men's hats. And he was making, like $9 or $10 a week, working a 6-day week. And he would tell me how he was able to buy lunch every day for 12 cents. And the lunch consisted of a herring, a big schmaltz herring out of the barrel. And my mouth waters now to think of it. And a big roll with poppy seeds and an onion. And life was beautiful.
This was perhaps the most mixed city, racially, ethnically, in the country. But cities all around the country had become more important because change was centered in the city. Business, into culture.
Nothing was like being in New York. Just the magic of everything. The world full of things to be explored. That time was one of a feeling of adventure, and your life is having a shape to it. Sort of a thread, like a narrative, a story. A feeling that anything may unfold.
the decade's startling changes would soon spread from America's cities to envelop the entire nation. Far from the speakeasies and the dance halls and the nightclubs, there was another America in the 1920s. Here, people still lived as their parents and grandparents had. They liked it that way.
In the early 1920s, this was a quiet, easy life. Neighbors would come over, what we call the front porch visits. And that's where there would be discussion, maybe a little gossip.
Throughout the 1920s, new technologies would transform daily life. At the beginning of the decade, most Americans lived without electricity. When night fell, only candles and lamps held off the darkness. America was electrified in the 20s. Electric lights extended the day, opened up new possibilities for work and play. That surge of new power to the cities. The majority of American homes had electricity.
You can't understand this century without understanding the effect, the impact of science and technology.
My father's generation is the one that really saw amazing changes. But he was born in 1900 in a world where the horse was still the main means of getting about. The car seemed to me more revolutionary in a way than anything that's happened since. Totally changed the kind of space we live in, really.
The car would give Americans a sense of autonomy and freedom. The freedom to escape their city or town, to go away on a vacation, or simply on a day's outing. By mid-decade, the government was spending more than $1 billion on the construction of highways, bridges, and tunnels. The beginnings of a national infrastructure which knit the country together.
My father took my mother and me in the car for the first ride through the Holland Tunnel. This was opening night. All the cars were lined up to go through the tunnel. I was petrified. I cringed. Suppose the water leaks in. How did they build the tunnel under the water? Where's the water? And I imagined as we were running through the tunnel that I heard the waves overhead. Out on the so-called highways of those days, outside of New York, we saw the billboards.
Roadways were soon dotted with a new phenomenon, roadside advertising.
They were big and colorful and beautiful, I thought.
Advertising helped transform not just the physical landscape, but the cultural one. Along with advertising came the expansion of a brand new consumer concept, credit. The old inhibition against debt came tumbling down, as everything from cars to clothes could be bought on time. Buy now, pay later became the order of the day. By 1927, 75% of all household goods were bought on credit. And in the last years of the decade, the item desired most was the radio.
First, we'd like to ask you to let us know if this broadcast is reaching you.
From its scratchy beginnings in 1920 as a mere hobby, radio would become a nationwide phenomenon as important as a car. Young radio enthusiast Albert Sindlinger was there at the birth of modern radio. In 1920, the night station KDKA, broadcasting from a factory rooftop in Pittsburgh, transmitted the results of the presidential election.
The Republican ticket of Harding and Coolidge is running well ahead
one of the gentlemen was reading the election returns. He got sick, so for about 35 or 45 minutes, I read election returns. Nobody had any comprehension of the significance of what was going on. But don't forget, there were only a couple of hundred listeners. Within 6 months, every store in America, even grocery stores, were selling radio.
Suddenly, all Americans were listening at the jokes. It was a kind of communal exercise here, and very much a strengthening of your notion of what it was to be an American.
Along with, and sometimes propelled by the great technological leap in the 1920s, social patterns in place for decades also began to shift. Nowhere was this more obvious than with the changes for American women. An expanding job market had given more and more women careers and the disposable income to do with what they wished. Throughout the 1920s, women would assert a newfound freedom and independence, and nothing symbolized it more than the 19th Amendment. In 1920, after 81 years of agitation, women won the right to vote.
A woman's lot had changed in almost every way. She thought that she had the right to live for herself rather than for her family, for others. Women were always supposed to. She went to bars. She went to after-hours clubs. She had shorter hair. She wore much more makeup. Women whose dresses reached to flesh. And a lot of 20 smashing prohibitions.
The more daring women of the day were known as flappers and vamps.
Sure, I remember flappers. They were all over the place. Older than me, but when you look at the flappers through the eyes of a young guy, wow. Whoa.
I think a flapper was the type of young woman who just wanted to see how far she could go and then would stop because she'd be afraid too far. And a vamp didn't care how she went.
The shattering ways of 1920s city life were spread by the media to rural America, places where the changes were not always so easy to get used to.
Smoke, drinking, being loose with talk, using profanity. This sifted down from the cities, from New York and Chicago. Fine. Unworn in our little community. Here was a girl who'd come home from, she'd been working in Chicago. She comes home with short dresses on. They were going to church with white gloves on. They were decidedly concerned about what future generation is going to bring.
This country was founded on a respect for God and a sense of righteousness and keeping the Sabbath day, and people have brought their children up under discipline and reading the scripture. And all of those things were part of the things that bound us together in America.
Solid. Go in very little corn.
As the cities grew in size and influence, many people in small-town America found them a breeding ground for new and often alien lives. In one small American town, the forces of traditional religion and modern science would clash in a battle heard around the world. Here in Dayton, Tennessee, in the summer of 1925, one of the century's most famous courtroom battles would take place. John T. Scopes stood accused of teaching Darwin's theory of evolution, that man and ape shared a common ancestor. That was against the law in Tennessee. The Scopes trial attracted the best legal brains of the time. William Jennings Bryan, 3 times presidential candidate and a Christian fundamentalist himself, came to prosecute. Clarence Darrow, the celebrated Chicago trial lawyer, came to defend Scopes. Outside, as the trial progressed in the scorching summer heat, Dayton had itself a carnival.
People would bring in trained chimpanzees dressed in suits and ties, and they'd lead them up and down the streets.
Read Your Bible was everywhere in town, posted up on the street, across the street, banners. And you walk maybe 100 yards this way, you'd have a street preacher. I didn't know what he was preaching about. You never saw the same people twice. You go to the same place next day, there'd be some other people from some other parts of the United States there. But it was a lot of hoopla. I enjoyed it.
The Scopes trial became emblematic. Everybody had to make up their mind. People who'd never been to Tennessee, couldn't even find Tennessee, had to think about this question. Do I believe in modern science?
At times, it seemed that the whole world had converged on Dayton.
The aisles were filled and the walls were lined with newspaper people from England, from Spain, from France. We had so many newspaper people there that you couldn't stir them with a stick.
When all the hoopla ended, John T. Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. A ruling later overturned on the technicality. What Scopes represented and what the world came to witness was a colossal clash of ideals. The cool reason of science seemed to threaten the deep and abiding roots of religion. It was one thing to replace the family mule with a Model T, but quite another to trade Matthew, Mark, and John for Einstein, Freud, and Darwin. For many people, these were confusing times. And what may have been the most unsettling about the pace of change in the 1920s was that people really wanted both the benefits and the familiar comforts of the past.
They want the fruits of modernity. They want automobiles, electricity, radios. And at the same time, they want it to remain 1850, and they know they cannot have both. And this creates psychological tension within American society that is then looking for something to go. People who can be different, been taught, and into the Ku Klux Klan.
Ku Klux Klan membership soared to 4 million in the 1920s.
Almost everybody that was a good citizen in the South was on immorality and deceit and fairness.
It created a great deal of, I'd say, consternation and debate and so on. They were not just opposed to the blacks, but they were opposed to the Catholics and the Jews or anybody else that came from somewhere. Going to people's houses, calling them out and insulting them, and whipping them, and things of that kind. This was not just peculiar to the South at Alabama, it was nationwide.
The Klan was actively recruiting in many northern states.
My father was asked if he would like to join the Ku Klux Klan. He grabbed the guy by the collar and threw him down the stairs. 3 nights later, almost directly across the street, there was a large cross burning. I still can see it in my mind. It was a dreadful, horrifying experience. My mother said, it's just as though they're guarding the gates of hell.
Those white people who to us and were in sympathy with us, they caught hell.
Was living in England. He and 2 childhood were seized by a Klan-inspired mob, enraged by reports of the rape and murder of a white couple.
Many of them out in the crowd had the robes and hood on too. And then the leader said, take all these niggas out and hang them.
His 2 friends were lynched. James Cameron barely escaped with his life.
They put a rope around my neck and they threw the other end over the tree. And I kept crying and hollering, I haven't done anything. But before they could hang me up, a voice said, take this boy back. He had nothing to do with any killing or raping. I looked up to heaven and I said, Lord, have mercy.
Throughout the decade, an estimated 200 people were lynched by the Klan. This organization, claiming to uphold the values and virtues of the past, became so full in the 1920s that it seized political control of 7 states. And in 1927, Klansmen marched 50,000 strong down the streets of the nation's capital. Clearly, the forces of 20s modernity had stirred a bitter resistance.
Then the Manasseh Mauler lashed out in his old ferocious style. Several fast, deadly punches.
In a decade fraught with so many changes, people in the 1920s seemed hungry for old-fashioned heroes, and an explosion in spectator sports provided them. Sports giants became household names, their every move followed by radio and an eager tabloid press. One name was known in more households than any other.
In our family, we were never baseball oriented, but I would have had to be deaf not to have heard about Babe Ruth.
George Herman Ruth, the Babe, reshaped America's pastime. In an era of big events, he excelled at the game's biggest excitement, the home run. He hit 60 of them.
Who cares? Let's fast forward.
Came to watch him take off. Once he was out of sight, it seemed as if all America held its breath.
In Yankee Stadium, they had 3 minutes of silence, praying. Everybody in the country was praying.
Flying the fuel-heavy single-engine plane was a battle against weather, hunger, and fatigue. For the entire 33-and-a-half-hour flight, the Western world wondered about the fate of that tiny plane somewhere over the vast Atlantic.
It was a Saturday night. They hadn't heard from him for a long time. And I was walking up 125th Street and someone shouted, they found him. He was flying over Ireland, and within an hour or so, he landed in Paris.
100,000 Parisians were there to welcome the shy young pilot. Lucky Liddy emerged from his plane carrying only a razor and a passport. Flight had represented the best of an era, a mastery of modern technology joined with old-fashioned values of courage, individualism, and hard-won achievement.
When Lindbergh came back, it was as though he walked on the water. The public couldn't get enough of him. He was the star. There wasn't a woman in America that wasn't crazy about him.
He was a hero. He was a nice guy. He was new. He was young. He was, he was kind of gawky, but that was what they wanted.
The parade for Lindbergh down Broadway was the biggest national celebration since the end of World War
I. Everybody became Lindbergh. They became the person that he was and represented. It was great. It made a big impression on me.
It was very exciting for all of us because we realized that a young man could do great things.
After Lindbergh's triumph, there remained only one continent for the airplane to conquer: Antarctica. The frozen and forbidding landscape at the bottom of the world was the boundary one of the century's great explorers, Admiral Richard Byrd, set out to break. His goal was to fly over the South Pole. His expedition was flooded with young and eager volunteers, all of them wanting to be heroes.
Admiral Byrd was going to select, I forget how many boys to go to the pole. Now, I was about 12 at the time, and I was nominated as one of the guys to go. The big thing was, Mom says, "Ma, what do you think? I'm going to go to the North Pole with Admiral Byrd." She says, "You can't go." I says, "Why?" She says, "You'll catch your death of cold." I never went. My cousin went instead.
There were 120 men connected with the expedition.
20-year-old Harvard student Norman Vaughn dropped out of school, trained for a year, and was finally selected to go on the adventure of a lifetime.
That had never been seen or touched before, and that just excited me beyond words. Absolutely a new frontier.
The expedition's home base was called Little America. Its 2-year mission was to conduct geological research and prepare for Byrd's record-breaking attempt.
We were responsible for getting out onto the interior as we could to Admiral Byrd's rescue expedition, should he have had a forced landing.
Just after midnight on November the 29th, 1929, Admiral Byrd's aircraft flew 500 feet above the geographic South Pole. He dropped a stone wrapped in an American flag. Americans had reached the ends of the earth. By the end of the 1920s, anything seemed possible.
Extraordinary about the decade of the 20s was a pandemic air of optimism, a feeling that the future of the country was unlimited. One of the great songs, it was Blue Skies, only but blue skies do I see.
The president promised blue skies in the country's future. At his inauguration in 1929, Herbert Hoover repeated the common wisdom of the day that Americans were on their way to riches. If proof was needed, all one had to do was look at the bubbling pool of wealth, the stock market.
the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, everybody was in the stock market. One of our chauffeurs was in the market. If he can be in the market, he can be in the market.
There were no regulations as we have now. People got away with murder all the time. The government didn't bother them. So they were all making money. They were doing very well.
A boom in buying had driven up prices. Suddenly, in October of 1929, investors price stock.
On October 29, 1929, it was obvious from the opening bell that things were wildly amiss.
At 9:30, there was a rumble on the floor. One of the page boys said, "Hey, Mike, look at the sell orders coming out of those phones."
The wheels really started to come off. The stock market went into a free fall. Crowded in the street outside the exchange.
Clock. The bell rang, and that was it.
More than $30 billion in paper value simply vanished that day as the stock market crashed.
The famous word crash. It was like
The bubble had burst with the decade's optimism.
People lost every penny that they had. Nobody had any pensions. There was no Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. If people lost their money, that was it. They were down and out.
people jumped off the George Washington Bridge, which had only just then, not long ago, been built. People we knew. My father was wiped out. He never, psychologically, he never recovered.
In 29, what do? It's the same story. Wash your face and hands and comb your hair and start all over again.
But as people would find out in the decade to come, a decade is different from the 20s, as from today was not going to be so easy. America, along with much of the world, faced the Great Depression. That's on the next episode of The Century, America's Time. I'm Peter Jennings. Thank you, Annie.
What y'all think about that? A bunch of mess, right? A big old mess just coming all over, doing what they need to do to take over the land. Taking over the lands from the Indians, pushing them. So basically taking over the lands, removal of the Indians from New York. We went over some information. I'm going to show you guys some more information on that with the part 2, getting into the Reconstruction and, you know, how they moved them out of New York specifically. I want to make sure I had that pulled up. And it's just funny how they went from nothing, eating straw in the street, to eating on Madison Avenue, like they living rich. All off of everything they removed us from. Removing the people, actually taking over their homes, laying in their beds, wearing their clothing, all of that. Just ridiculous. All the proof that we need to make sure these people pay for everything they have done has been thrown in our face, like we're just so ignorant to not put the pieces together. We've seen it all. We always find it all. There's no hiding. There's discovery, because reality and truth will always come to the light. You can't hide the light. The truth is the light. So when it comes to the truth, there's always ways to convey it and bring it out and make sure that we get what is exactly going on, and able to put the outline of these things, laying them out, showing that we are, we passed the stages of being ignorant and stupid and not understanding. We're not blackened in our mind. We're not blackened in thought. We're not blackened in our spirits. So we are fully aware, and in true light we walk and stand. We're about to make sure that we on it, bro. We definitely is on it. Trust it. We got plans for this. All of the deceit, all of the lying, all of the reconstruction of stories, making propaganda, making news stories, making entertainment outlets, all of these things to help construct the story of his story. Lying, fictitious backgrounds, fictitious stories. We read in the books a couple of days ago, showed us everything on these same immigrants, right? It showed us and told us that all of these people by their name, they came in, they were assuming our names, all of this stuff. Yeah, it's time. They're going to get it. All right, guys, we're a little over 2 hours right now. I think this was a very good bill for you guys to see this thrown in your face. It's good for us to hear it and know it and talk about it, but it's really great when we can actually look at it and see it for ourselves, see what's going on, see the timeline, see the actual pictures of things that were going on. And it cracked me up how they tried to show the littlest shade of the indigenous Indian that were there. And you see how well dressed they were, well kept, but hey, they didn't want to mention them. They just showed a quick flicker, like, see, we're putting the truth out there. We're just not going to mention it because we don't want to have to tell that part. Deception is the same as a lie. Deception is the same as a lie. All right. Will it be a stock market crash in 2029? They already came with the virus. Probably, bro. That's why that stock stuff, man, I don't get into all of that. I mean, I've thought about it. I pandered a little bit, but I can't get into all of that. It's just a way to take your money, assume everything from you. Yes, 21 says, 21 in the building. Peace, love, blessings to all. You guys already know that this was a phenomenal piece of information to break out, to show these lies and, let these people know that we see them. we see you. You're in the open. We see you. We looking right at you. You know what I'm saying? So we just have to make sure that we are aware of these things and, continue to break out poor mini KKK in 1920 to keep the American Indians quiet of the truth and the murders of the people for the stolen land, slaughtering, hanging, burning crosses, doing all these different things to our people. The time has come for us to put an end to all of the silence, to anything that we find blackened in our mind as far as following the lies, the deception. We got to know. Appreciate you too, bro. You already know. Yes, not half-ass truth. We want all the truth. That's why we exposing their ass, sis. All right, guys. Peace, love, blessings, and y'all have a good one. Blessings into